A great way to find out if there's still scratches on your scales is to give them a quick buff with some white jeweler's rouge. This works great for horn. So I'm going to do about a 30-second buff on each one of these, and that'll give me a really good idea as to where the scratches are that I still need to sand out on these scales. Plus, this part's fun because you get to see an idea of how they'll look when you're finished. As I was already aware, I have some more scratching on the scale over here by the wedge end on the one scale here. So I'm going to have to take this back to the back to sandpaper for a little bit. But you can also notice that there are a few scratches here that I probably would have missed if I hadn't gone back to the buffer. There's a couple scratches right here through this area, and so I'll concentrate on hitting those areas when I go back to the sandpaper. There's also some right here by the pivot. Might be kind of hard to see. So I'm going to work on getting all those scratches out when I go back to sandpaper. By taking these to the buffer, this one seemed really good, which is funny because it looks pretty darn good, and you can see that there's not a lot of scratches on this scale at all. So primarily this one that I missed, so who knows why. Anyway, my next step here is to do a mock-up fit on the razor here. I have a few 1/16 inch micro fastener bolts and nuts and a couple washers here. Always use washers when I do a mock-up because I tighten it up a little bit with a pair of pliers, and if you don't use the washers, sometimes you can scratch the horn when you're tightening them up. When you're looking at your wedge, a lot of the times off the belt sander, you'll notice that one side might be a little bit thicker than the other. If this ever happens, I always put the thicker side to the top of the razor. So you can see here that I have a nice wedgy shape. These scales are turning out really, really nice, I think. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to just take another bolt here, and I won't tighten this down, but I at least want to see how it's going to fit. And you can see that we pretty much dodged a bullet here. This is going to fit pretty much dead center, first attempt. This is due to the fact that, number one, the scales are even, they're the same thickness. Number two, we started with a nice flat blank. And number three, we have a straight razor. The grind is even, the tang is straight, and there's no problems with this particular razor. So this thing doesn't need any adjustment, which I must say I was hoping. I always hope for that. I'm going to concentrate on the areas where I can see the scratches. The one thing that's annoying about wet sanding is it's very difficult to see how far you've gone or whether or not you've removed them, because the water pretty much makes the whole thing look shiny and perfect. So I must have spent too much time around the edges and not enough time in the middles when I first sanded them down. So I think I got all the scratches, so I'm going to move up a couple of grits, and then I'll be ready to shape the rest of my wedge. I've tightened down my wedge in the exact place that I want it, and so now I need to sand down all of the edges until it's very, very close to the scale. It's okay if I hit the scale. It'll just require a little bit more hand sanding to remove those scratches again. So as you can see, I got very close to the scales. I hit the scale a couple times here and there, but that's okay because my next step is to hand sand again. I'm going to be hand sanding this wedge, entire wedge, and the end of the scales area. By now you guys are probably sick of watching me hand sand, so I'll pretty much skip through this portion. Just so you know, I'm going from 220 to 320 to 400 to 600 to 800. This is how you get those perfectly fitted wedges. You sand them to fit after you have screwed them onto the scale and they are in their final position. You'll notice that it is perfectly smooth from every side, and so the next step here is to take this wedge area to the buffer, and this will be the last step for the wedge. This wedge is totally done now, so I'm going to separate it out from the scales, and then I'll bring the scales back to the buffer. So my scales are getting a good buffing now. If there's no scratches at the end of this buff, then these scales will be done. I came outside for some better light after I finished buffing these scales. You see that they are nearly flawless. I'm really happy with the way they've turned out, and I don't think I'm going to have to do any more sanding, which is great. They look really, really good.